It's just such a pleasure to be here, to be able to join with so many of Ken's friends and colleagues to honor him and his contributions today. I'm very grateful for this invitation and for just having Ken as part of my life. It's really been a treat, and looking forward to a lot of continued work and friendship together. The talk that I'm going to give today is a little odd, I think. What I'm going to be doing is talking about the idea that even though religion and spirituality bring a lot of benefits to people, that there's also a shadow side to it. I'm not going to show I don't think I'm going to show any numbers or stats today. Those are underlying the work that we're doing, but the talk that I'm going to be giving is more conceptual and also reflects to some degree my own background in training as a spiritual director as well as a psychologist. And it also kind of reflects the fact that I have this giant research lab now, so I'm kind of, many of my students and a postdoc are over here at this table. So I want to kind of introduce you to them and the work that we've been doing together. And I've also been on sabbatical this year, and it's been a year where I've just been sifting through a lot of things too. So, and stepping back to some degree from my usual roles of, analyzing a lot of data and writing a lot of first author papers. So I'm a little stepped back from that right now, and I'm in a place of trying to think about some bigger issues, and have been in more of a quieter space. So some of the stuff that will come up, especially at the end of the talk, is just more touchy-feely along those lines, and that's fun for me. So hopefully that'll be all right. And those of you who want to see data, just Google our lab, and you can look at the papers, and there's all kinds of cool numbers and stuff. So when I came into graduate school in the early 1990s, there wasn't very much at the time empirically focused on the idea of any kinds of struggles around religion or spirituality. But there was a literature that was starting to emerge on potential benefits of faith. So we know that religious faith and community can help with things like attachment security, can provide a sense of comfort for people in times of stress. Religion often serves as a major meaning system that helps to orient people to what really matters in life. And very importantly, for a lot of people, religion and spirituality can provide this sense of ultimate hope, that there's something beyond this world that we have to look forward to. And that can go along with reduced fear of death. So when I came into wanting to start looking at the psychology of religion and spirituality, a lot of the emphasis was on starting to document some of these benefits of religion and spirituality for mental health, and then much of this was carrying over into physical health as well. There were also studies looking at things like how religious service attendants could predict things like living longer, living healthier. So what came to my mind as somebody who had been raised as a religious person, but who often had quite a few conflicts around religion, was this question of, is it all about sunshine and rainbows? Is it all just happy stuff? Is religion just a security blanket for the insecure? Freud would probably say so. But with the work that was coming out, I was a little concerned that, yes, we do need to show that religion can be good for you, but there's this difficult aspect too. So my sense of it, and a lot of this was happening right around the time that the positive psychology movement was also starting, where I thought there were a lot of great things, but I have kind of more of a melancholy sort of personality. So I tend to look at what are the potential problems, what could go wrong. And in thinking about this work on religion and spirituality, along with the rest of a lot of the positive psychology work, I felt as though positivity is good, but that a relentless positivity can feel forced, inauthentic, or disconnected, that people are just kind of putting on a happy face. And having to have a uniform sense of positivity can't capture the beauty of light and shadow that exists in our emotional world. For 2.5 years, I did a blog for Psychology Today entitled Light and Shadow, Challenges in Religious and Spiritual Life, because I really wanted to try to get at this more textured sense of what religion and spirituality can be about. And broadly speaking, I'm just interested in this question about what's the right amount of light to really accurately represent our human reality. This is going to depend a lot on who you talk to. But I think when looking at questions of ultimate meaning and purpose, you know, there's going to be individual differences. Some people are going to look at it through kind of a dark and gloomy lens, you know, like an underexposed photo. They could use some more light. Some people are a little too bright, though, and then the whole thing gets kind of washed out. So in coming into this field, I was really wanting to be one of the people who could help to provide some more nuance to the picture of what happens with religion and spirituality for people. So empirically, I'll tell you just a little bit about our early work in this area. I did my first work with Ann Yali, who was a fellow grad student with me at Stony Brook University, and Bill Sanderson, who was my supervisor on internship, Montefiore Medical Center in New York. We developed the Religious Comfort and Strain Scale, which got at the idea that religion can not only provide comfort, but sometimes people can have a sense of being alienated from God, or could have fear and guilt around religion or interpersonal issues. I've worked with several colleagues to write review chapters and articles on religious and spiritual struggles over the last few years. So if you want an introduction to the topic, in the handbook with Ken, and in another one with Ray Paluzzian and Crystal Park, we have some overviews of the topic for you. And most of my work has been on anger toward God. So over the last 10 years or so, I've published different papers with different students and colleagues on this topic. And knowing that the time here today is so limited, I'm basically going to take the 10 years of work and put it onto one slide. It's always kind of depressing to do that, but this is really what it comes down to. So what we know about anger at God, and I'm not even putting citations up here, you know, this is what we find. It is really common. So in big national studies, depending how you word the question, anywhere between 1/3 and 2/3 of people will say that they're sometimes angry at God, among people who hold some belief in God. And people are afraid to admit it. So what do you do about it? You need to be able to provide a safe environment for people to admit that they're feeling angry toward God and try to help normalize it. We have several papers focusing on the idea and kind of documenting that many people see anger toward God as being morally wrong, and they're really afraid to go there. And the more devout you are, at least within Christianity, and it looks like within Islam as well, people are really scared to talk about it. Within Judaism, because of the cultural emphasis on wrestling with God and having that sort of dialogue being more part of the tradition, there doesn't seem to be as much fear around anger toward God as there is within Christianity, for example. We do find that when people receive supportive responses, if they tell somebody that they're angry at God, they have a much more resilient response to whatever it is they're dealing with. And they're more likely to feel that their faith grew as a result, just by having the person say to them, "Oh, I felt that way too," or, you know, "That's totally understandable." But if people get shamed or judged, like, "You really shouldn't feel that way," or "I don't know about that," it predicts things like more difficulty resolving the anger, so you're more likely to stay angry, you're more likely to exit the relationship with God, and you have more things like substance abuse going on. So just giving somebody a safe place and giving yourself a safe place to say to yourself, "I'm angry at God," it's a good idea. Normalizing it is, at this point coming out of our work, I would say the most important thing to be able to do. And just forget about any kind of one-size-fits-all solution, especially if you're looking for any kind of a theological magic bullet that's going to explain the problem of suffering to people. If I had more time, I would go into my stories about this and how I thought I had one, and it really backfires when you think you've got, this is my little answer for suffering. And in general, it's helpful if you can save any kind of theological tinkering with people's beliefs until after the crisis. I mean, the chaplains would know this much better than I do, but usually when people are in crisis, it's much better to just be able to tolerate what they're saying and what's going on for them, rather than trying to come in and see what their beliefs are and look for the distortions and try to fix their theology. So in terms of how to assess religious and spiritual struggle, I told you we had our little comfort and strain measure, but nobody really uses that. What everybody uses is Ken's wonderful work on religious coping in response to negative life events. So we had the misfortune of having our religious comfort and strain measure come out right about the same time as the RCOPE and the brief RCOPE. And so everybody uses the RCOPE to look at negative religious coping, which now I think even Ken agrees, we're kind of calling this religious and spiritual struggle now, right? Can we more or less equate them, Ken? People are always asking me. I'm like, okay, they're pretty much the same thing. So you've got it from him. It's pretty much the same thing. And these wonderful and widely used measures, the longer RCOPE, which is very thorough, and the brief RCOPE. And in speaking with Ken, when we started working together, so we have a grant on religious and spiritual struggle from the Templeton Foundation. We really wanted to develop another measure that could get at more domains of struggle, because with the brief RCOPE, it was primarily getting at divine struggle, and then there was an interpersonal item and a demonic item. We wanted to get a broader range in one measure. So I'm going to very quickly just tell you about the domains captured by our religious and spiritual struggle scale. It's got 26 items, 6 subscales, and you can focus it on a specific time frame, like in the past week or month, or a specific event. We're also working on a brief version that will be about half the length of this version. But by the time we get all of that validated and published, that will probably be, a year or so before that's available for broader use. So first of all, divine struggle. This is negative feelings focused on a deity. Things like anger at God or feeling punished by God. Here's a couple of sample items. Then we've got what we call the intrapersonal struggles, meaning the ones that are focused, the concerns are focused inside the self. So we've got moral struggle or guilt. Here a person is just trying to deal with following their moral or spiritual principles, or they're maybe having guilt about things that they've done that are wrong. And here's a couple of the sample items off of that subscale. So next we've got crises of ultimate meaning. For many people, the idea of spirituality is broadly conceived as something that has to do with what gives you a sense of deep meaning in life. So the struggle here would be an absence of perceived meaning. And notice that this is, all of these struggles other than that divine one are ones that we don't refer to God or to any sort of a deity in the items, so that these could be taken by people who believe in God or not, or who are religiously involved or not. Here's a couple of our ultimate meaning items. Then we have doubt and confusion about religious beliefs. And an important part here is that our scale is tapping doubt-related struggles. We're not assuming that everybody who's having doubts about their faith is necessarily struggling. Some of you might be familiar with the quest approach to religion, for example, where doubts are actively embraced. Here we're talking about people having doubts and questions or feeling confused, and that's scaring them or bothering them. Then we've got interpersonal struggles, which is conflicts with other people or institutions about religious issues. It's a pretty broad category. Here's a few of those items. And finally, we've got demonic, which was one that originally we had questions about whether to put in. I remember talking to Ken about it. We knew it had been tapped in the in the ARCOPE and the brief ARCOPE, but we just weren't sure how often it was going to come up. Here we're talking about the belief that the devil or evil spirits are attacking people or causing negative events. It's really been understudied. Here are a few sample items on the demonic subscale. And what we find is that all of these struggles are reported by people in the US with some frequency, whether they're college students or adult populations. The demonic struggles tend to be endorsed the least, and they're going to be endorsed, of course, more in faith traditions where people believe in the demonic. So there's a real confound with conservative religiosity and orthodoxy on that particular scale. So you've got to control for that if you're going to use that scale. Divine struggle usually is reported at relatively low levels, and then the other ones are endorsed more often. So recently, some other work that's been done on the measure. Hisham Abu Raya has done some great work on validating our scales among Jewish and Muslim samples in Israel. And Shema Saratoprak, a new student in our lab, is going to be doing more work looking at struggles, including the concept of spiritual jihad in Muslim populations. Nick Stouners, who is here today, has worked very long and hard on a bifactor model of the religious and spiritual struggle scale. So if you want to know fancy stats, he's the person to go talk to about this. And Stephanie Homolka, who's also here, is looking at struggles among youth and has done her dissertation trying to validate and getting quite good results with our religious and spiritual struggle scale among high school students, and also adding items that are specific to religious disagreements with peers and with parents that are things that are, we really don't want to miss that when we're looking at youth. So Stephanie's doing some really cool work on that. In terms of some of the things that predict struggle, this is going to be an incredibly stripped down list. I could give a whole talk just on this, and we don't have time. So I'm just going to show off some of the stuff from the people in our lab. So Josh Grubbs, who is here today, who's going to be joining the faculty at Bowling Green this fall, and Josh Wilt, who's a postdoc in our lab, have worked with several of us others on what types of people struggle more, personality types of predictors. Basically find a lot of the same things that cause people to be distressed in other areas lead to, are the same things that are associated with religious and spiritual struggles. You're more neurotic, you're less agreeable, conscientiousness to some degree, and low self-esteem tend to go with them. And we've been able to find that these personality factors not only predict the struggles concurrently, but to some degree, there's at least some modest prediction over time in longitudinal studies. So that's been helpful to get to do that. And looking at stressful life events, we've got Alex Eustephanis with facial hair. He's over here without facial hair today, who's looking at a very large nationally representative data set of youth to look at whether an accumulation of stressful life events could cause people to either join a religion or decide to exit religion. And Nick is also looking at, in some of our other data sets, at whether stressful life events, how they're associated with struggle, and also looking at things associated with neuroticism as well. But in coming up with this slide, I find I keep trying to put in all these pictures of people, and on this one I started to think, this looks familiar. The way I've got these. Oops! I just shut my thing off. Oh. I was trying to hit the pointer to show you that. I was like, this is looking familiar. And I was like, this works. And then I've got 9 people in the lab now. So these are my 9 students and postdocs. We've got our happy bunch. Okay. But moving along. In terms of non-believers, there are some real issues here as well that we ran into. We had an article that came out in 2011 on anger at God in the Journal of Personality and Social Psych. And we found that some, but not all, atheists and agnostics report anger around the idea of God, or will say anger at God, depending how the question is worded. And then there was kind of a media misunderstanding that happened, which is probably the reason that several of the people that are in my lab now are there. So on CNN.com, a headline came out, "Anger at God Common, Even Among Atheists," which was just enough of a misrepresentation that it made people quite angry. So We're trying to look more carefully now in our work at what's really going on with non-believers around anger toward God. Why might they be endorsing this? So very quickly, for some non-believers, the idea of God could trigger bad memories of old anger at God events from when they used to believe. And that's going to make them mad to think about that. So you might say, I remember that God didn't heal my grandpa from cancer when I prayed. That made me mad. That's why I decided not to believe. It's going to make them mad. They're going to have a memory of that. Also, it could trigger a negative God image. Just the idea of God could trigger the idea that if God exists, God's a jerk, and that makes me mad. Or the idea of God could trigger negative thoughts about religion or religious people, which could lead to anger as well. And David Bradley and Alex are both looking at issues having to do with struggles among non-believers in the lab. Reasons why atheists and agnostics don't believe in a deity. There's intellectual reasons, but also emotional and relational reasons come up too, and people will endorse those. We have people looking at hypothetical God images, like if you were to find out that God were to exist, would this be good news or bad news? Get some pretty interesting responses to that. Microaggressions against non-believers. So atheists are distrusted and are often disliked about as much as rapists. So there's the atheists often, people give them a hard time, and we're trying to understand that better. And we also want to look at whether our religious and spiritual struggle scale can be used among non-believers and the non-religious. And Nick and Alex have both done work looking at that. It actually comes out looking pretty good. Just don't go with the demonic. Got to get rid of the demonic subscale, and the rest of it works. The main question that I want to get into in terms of future questions is this issue of whether religious and spiritual struggle can ever lead to growth. Because this is something that, as clinicians, as chaplains, as people, we would like to know this. The research data are really unclear at this point. The findings are mixed. And there's really the question about whether it's the struggle or the response to it that leads to growth. I think from what we can tell so far, it's probably the response to it. It's not having something awful happen to you in and of itself that's going to make you a stronger person. There's something about what you do in response or what happens to you that could lead you in that direction, or that might lead you in a direction of greater emotional difficulty. So what I'm going to get into now are some thorny issues. These are things for which I have no data, but things that I've been thinking about a lot this year in trying to take a bigger perspective on religious and spiritual struggle, and in particular, this narrower issue of growth. So first of all, you get into the question of what exactly we mean by growth. And it's easy to say, for psychologists at least, to say, if you have improved character, you become a nicer person, you become more grateful, life seems more meaningful, better relationships with others. Those seem like growth. But there be other things too, or tougher decisions. Because depending on your worldview, which one of these do you think is growth? Do we learn how to focus more on the here and now, as through mindfulness training? Or is it about the hereafter and where we're going, what's going to happen to us after we die? A person could seem to grow spiritually in either one of these areas, and a person with another worldview could say, I'm not sure that that's growth. Which one is growth? Getting serious about spiritual warfare for people who believe in a cosmic battle of good and evil, this is serious business. You get serious about learning the devil's tricks, and you get out there and fight. Or is this dualism just part of the problem that we're all dealing with, making things into black and white and good and bad? Is there a way to bring these together, to have a both and on these things? Which one is growth? Do you more fully embrace your own faith tradition? Or do you decide that it's time to leave? Depending on who you are in your life situation, either one of these could be growth. Another key question is whether we as humans are the only initiators of growth. So in a paper that I did with Ken, Todd Hall, and Valencia Harriot, who's also here today. And this was a specifically Christian article it's for a special issue of Journal of Positive Psych on Christian Psych. So we were just looking at Christians here. And we found that perceived growth from struggle for these Christians was linked with the things that we do, positive religious coping. Of course, we expected that. But it was also linked with a perception of God's helpful actions. So there's this idea that we do things to cope with things in our lives. But the idea that hasn't been looked at as much is that people might perceive God taking action. God spoke to me, God healed me, God put someone into my life. That's what made the difference, not what I did. So we're trying to look more at this idea of a two-way relationship. And Val is looking at the many ways that people experience themselves as hearing from God in her master's project. Also, what about things that aren't God-related but are still supernatural? We're getting into this in our new grant on supernatural attributions, which Templeton is funding will start on July 1st. Mystical and near-death experiences could be a way to resolve a struggle. Some people are having these mystical experiences by taking psychedelic drugs. There's all kinds of ways to go about this. Angel encounters could be life-changing if this happens to you. Contact with spirits, this makes a lot of people really nervous. You could have your animal spirits, you could have your contact with the dead. This can affect people. We don't tend to look at it that much, though, in regular religious coping work. And finally, the things I've been getting really curious about this year are ways that we can capture growth from suffering in ways that don't always involve verbal processing and analytical processing and verbal insights. And these are things that non-psychologists have looked at plenty already, but psychologists, we tend to get stuck with the words. So in trying to experience growth or healing spiritually, might there be a role for things like silence, as in contemplative prayer, or as in being in a retreat, just being off by yourself, wordless prayer, centering prayer, music, visual arts. You see something and it ends up being transformative for you. Physical movement, energy work, got your chakras and your vortexes. It makes the conservative Christians really nervous. I'm a conservative Christian. Touch. Because Annette's here, I can at least say sex. She's already broken through that. Like, that's the intervention I want. Or joy and play. Things that we might be having trouble accessing because we're so busy trying to think of what's the best way to cognitively reframe this struggle that I'm going through. So these are just some of the things kind of near and dear to my own heart that I just wanted to sort of lay out there that we do not have scales or even questions developed for yet. Symbols and metaphors are another thing. I'm not going to get into all my symbols and metaphors because we need to end the talk. But you could have a symbol of okay, I'm going to do it really fast. Could there be necessary seasons in life? Struggles are necessary seasons? Heroic journeys that people go through? They have their share of trials, right? If you can shape your narrative of what you're going through into a heroic journey, that often really helps people. And they've got storms, right? So you can bring this into your story of these storms of life that you're going through. And can heroes exist without their villains? You've got to have somebody coming up and being an adversary sometime in your story. And your adversary might end up being an important part of your story. So can struggles help us to become as silver refined or like diamonds that are formed under pressure? And if struggle really is a catalyst for growth in our lives, which I believe it can be, or if it's this vital part of life's journey that we're maybe all need to experience, then maybe it really all does come back to the rainbows. That's where I intended to end. I'm sorry I ran over by like 3 minutes, but oh well.